Right now, the biggest concern for the Atlanta Falcons heading into their bye week is their offense.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel, where you can start the season with a big return. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. So if you know me, you know I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Mr. Drew, aka the Jolly Green Giant, aka Mr. aka, and I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for a very long time, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that go strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And to become an everyday, all you have to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today we will revisit the topic of Jimmy Lake potentially losing defensive play calling responsibilities over the bye week. We'll talk about, the defense. We'll get into a conversation on where we're at with this defense. But first, we got to start with why I think the offense is the main concern right now for the Atlanta Falcons. And I don't like making individual games referendums on the team. But since we are on a bye week, this is the perfect opportunity to kind of take a step back and look at sort of things as a whole, right? And assess things so far. So, we know that the Falcons offense has been very good throughout the season. And over the last 6 weeks, they've been essentially elite. And that's been what's fueling their success over the last 6 weeks. And hopefully will continue to fuel their success over the remaining 6 games of the season, all the way into the playoffs. And we talked about it all off season about how the Falcons brought in Kirk Cousins to stabilize the quarterback situation. But the real bet that they were making was on new offensive coordinator Zach Robinson to sort of be the real hero, right? Because he's going to be the guy that takes all the disparate parts and glues them together, right? You got the new veteran quarterback, you got Darnell Mooney, new look wide receiver core, integrate those pieces with the pieces that you're inheriting, like Bijan Robinson, Drake London, Kyle Pitts, Tyler Algier, the allegedly top 5 Falcons offensive line. Put all those pieces together, and Zach Robinson's going to cook up something to make some pretty good soup, as it says, and make it all work, right? And we saw that get off to a little bit of a slow start in September, which we talked about during the offseason was probably going to happen. But then we got that Thursday night game against the Bucs, and everything seemed to take off after that point, right? And there's 6 categories that if you're an everyday of this podcast, we've often used to sort of measure offense and defensive success. We usually talk about it in the context of defense, but we'll flip the script and talk about it offense, right? It's run game, it's pass protection for offense, pass rush for defense, third down efficiency, red zone efficiency, explosive plays, turnovers are the 6 categories, right? And when you look at the Falcons offense in those 6 areas, they've been kind of middling this season, not elite by any means. 15th in run game according to expected points added, EPA per run, 10th in terms of lowest sack rate in the NFL allowed this year so far, 18th in third down efficiency, 22nd in red zone efficiency, 13th in explosive plays per game, 20th in drives that end in a turnover. And that's pretty fitting because throughout the offseason, we kind of discussed that, the expectations, or at least I had for this Falcons offense, was something around being like the 14th best offense in the NFL, not necessarily being the elite unit that I think a lot of people thought they would be. But over the last 6 games, and specifically talking about weeks 5 through 10, not counting the Broncos game, we saw this offense become elite in a lot of those areas. They were 3rd in rushing EPA during that stint of 6 games, 11th in sacks allowed, 6th in third down efficiency, 6th in red zone efficiency, tied for 2nd in the NFL in terms of the most explosive plays in the NFL, 14th in turnovers rate allowed and whatnot. And so we were thinking, okay, like this is maybe that elite offense. And if we can ride this all the way to the end of the season, that'll be great. Now, obviously that elite offense did not show up on Sunday. And we'll probably get into more of the reasons why that was tomorrow on the podcast. We should be joined by Alan Stirk of the Falcoholic to talk a little bit more about that. I did get a glance at the film on Monday morning, but we'll have done a deeper dive by tomorrow's episode. And my initial assessment from that quick glance at the film was it was a complete team loss in terms of the offense and the defense. And on the offense, I don't think really anybody played well. You didn't get great play from Kirk Cousins. The run blocking was inconsistent. Right, this was the best game that the Denver run defense seemed to have. If you look at certain metrics like EPA and whatnot, which is one of the reasons why I continue to push, that I don't think the Falcons offensive line is all that it's cracked up to be. It's still one of the better offensive lines in football, but not the elite unit that I think it's often overhyped to be. Pass protection was okay for the most part, right? Until the game got out of hand. But there were several plays where Kirk had all day to throw, where the pass protection was, elite, and he had all day to throw, but nobody got open. Other times guys got open, but then he didn't have all day to throw to hit those guys. And, speaking of guys getting open, that was something that we talked about last week with the Falcons struggled with early in that Saints game. We got off to the slow start in the Saints game because the Saints played a lot of man coverage. Falcons weren't doing enough from a receiver standpoint to win in those situations. And we talked about how that could potentially be a bigger issue against the Denver Broncos because they have better corners than the Saints have, given the injuries that the Saints were dealing with last week. And from what I could tell, it was an issue with this Broncos team throughout the game, right? But as I said, it's a team loss. There's no easy fix. But I think, the good thing is that, having sort of the entire team suck, basically, could potentially work out in your favor where, it brings everybody together, right? It galvanizes everybody to be like, yeah, we all need to play better. We all need to put in the effort. We all need to sort of, put our heads down and get it right and whatnot. And so we'll see if the Falcons can come out of the bye and play much better football. But for a lot of these reasons, I'm not necessarily in panic mode at this point in time. Because, we have seen this offense play at a high level for most of this season. Our biggest concern during that 6 weeks of elite play that we were seeing from our offense from weeks 5 through 10, starting with that Thursday night game against the Bucs and finishing with a win over the Dallas Cowboys. Most of those games were not against premium competition, right? The one capable, air quotes, capable defense that you played during that 6-game stretch, and then not to knock the Bucs or anything like that, but they haven't been great. As of over the last 6 games, basically. But the one capable defense you played during that stretch was Seattle, and you struggled. They basically shut you down in that game. And now that's happened again against Denver. So rather than sort of being a one-off that we wanted to treat the Seattle game as, now it's starting, you got 2 data points, right? It's starting to become a pattern. It's starting to become a trend, right? And the question is going to be whether or not they're going to be able to buck that trend when they come out of the bye facing 2 very good defenses in the LA Chargers and Minnesota Vikings. And, they're going to need their offense to step up in those games and play much better football if they are going to win those games. And they need to, in my humble opinion, win at least one of those games, right, to sort of continue controlling their destiny, right? We don't want to have a conversation about the Atlanta Falcons and another fourth quarter collapse, if you get my drift, right? Hopefully that's a thing of the past. So we will see on that front when it comes to the Falcons, team success, wins, losses, playoff hopes and all that stuff. But, as I've said all year long, the Falcons love the drama, right? They're going to make it as dramatic as possible. So again, get ready, guys. Again, I told y'all, I've been telling y'all for months, make sure you renew your prescription on your blood pressure meds, your heart medication, because they will absolutely make it as dramatic as possible, over these next 7 weeks as we wrap up the season. But we won't be wrapping up today's episode, talking about the drama, right? The most dramatic thing that you're seeing among at least the fan base is, involving the Atlanta Falcons defense. And we'll talk a little bit about what went wrong against the Denver Broncos and sort of, can they get back to playing quote unquote winning defensive football? And we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Pre-alcohol probiotic drink by Z-Biotics is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic that was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. It's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. Pre-alcohol produces an enzyme to break this byproduct down. Just remember to make Z-Biotics your first drink of the night. Drink responsibly, and you'll feel your best tomorrow. I first gave pre-alcohol a try when I was hanging out with some college buddies, and you wouldn't believe how on top of my game I was the next day. And, I'm definitely drinking much more responsibly today than I was back then when I used to hang out with my college buddies all the time. But if you want to sort of keep enjoying your tomorrows, make sure you go to zbiotics.com FanDuel.com/LockedOnNFL to learn more and get 15% off your first order when you use Locked On NFL at checkout. ZBiotics is backed with a 100% money back guarantee, so that if you're not satisfied, for any reason, they'll refund you your money, no questions asked. Remember to head to ZBiotics.com/LockedOnNFL and use code LockedOnNFL at checkout for 15% off. Now, guys, I want you to get ready to tackle the NFL action this season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets. If you win, FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on football all in one place. So you can get that hunch in the middle of the game. You can go check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just go to FanDuel.com to join today, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Go check it out to see the action. Houston 7.5-point favorites over the Dallas Cowboys on Monday Night Football. You want to get a jump on Week 12 lines where the Kansas City Chiefs, get revenge against the Carolina Panthers, being 10.5-point favorites, or are you going to get a great, nail-biting type of game with the Packers 1.5-point favorites against the 49ers in Week 12? So never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. So what is up with the defense? Now, when we talk about what happened yesterday against the Broncos on defense, we'll completely review the film and we'll go into some of that tomorrow. But it did seem like injuries impacted things a little bit more than I expected. I figure, we knew the Falcons were down a couple of starters on defense, 3 corners, 2 starters, and Mike Hughes and D. Alford. But, I figured, okay, they're role players, like they shouldn't break their entire defense losing a couple of role players and replacing those guys with role players. But at least at first glance, it did seem like the communication in the secondary was not nearly as good as it has been in the past, right? With the backups in the game, with Richie Grant and Natron Brooks and Kevin King and Clark Phillips all sort of filling in those duties, right? It seemed like motion and misdirection, really got them on a couple of times, for some key moments in that game. So kudos to the Broncos, but, the opposite of kudos to the Atlanta Falcons. I guess the opposite of kudos is, putting dog poop in a brown paper bag and lighting it on fire. I don't know, guys. But, you take those miscommunication breakdowns and you sprinkle that on top of a bend but don't break defense that was doing far too much breaking, right? We know they bend all the time. It's a question of, do they break? Right? They were breaking far too much on third downs and red zone. And that to me is the kind of the recipe for disaster that you had, the flaming bag of dog poop that was yesterday's performance. Now, when you look at the defensive performance as a whole this year, and then going back to those 6 categories where we talk about stopping the run, affecting the quarterback with your pass rush, third down efficiency, red zone efficiency, not giving up explosive plays, creating turnovers for your defense. The Falcons in those 6 categories overall this season, they're 19th against the run, 32nd in sack rate, 30th in third down efficiency, 22nd in red zone efficiency, 7th in explosive plays allowed, 24th in turnovers. Now, they've been better over the last 6 weeks. Again, weeks 5 through 10, when we say last 6 weeks, right? They were 12th against the run, last in sacks still, 24th on third downs, 22nd in red zone, 19th in explosive plays allowed, 20th in turnovers. So if you didn't catch that, over the last 6 weeks, they improved their run defense, third downs, and turnover rate. They maintain basically the same level pass rush and red zone, and they declined in terms of giving up more explosive plays. But if you look at those rankings that are mainly in the low 20s, right, their average ranking across those 6 categories is about 21.5. So let's say 22nd for the sake of argument. That's kind of winning football for this football team, right? Because that's kind of what you would think was what you wanted to see from this team going into the season, going in with these expectations into the season, because that's what the 2023 Rams were, right? They were a team that was a top 10 offense and were roughly 22nd, depending on what metrics you look at, but let's say roughly 22nd last year. I think they were 22nd in DVOA last year on defense, right? That's kind of what they were, right? And that was a formula that the Rams were able to ride all the way to the postseason. And over the last 6 weeks, you were getting a similar formula from the Atlanta Falcons. And the hope was that we would continue to see that formula consistently over the final 7 games. We did not get that against Denver. Will we get that against the remaining 6 games, right? Can they get back to that type of winning football? So I say all that because, we're going to talk more about it, but I think the expectation is that the Falcons defense should be good. And it's like, no, they just got to be good enough. This has been the thing you've heard me say over and over and over and over again. There was never any plan. There should have never been any plan, not by people in the building, not by people outside the building, that the Falcons were going to have a good defense this year. It was always an issue of, is it good enough with what the offense is bringing to the table? And so that goes back to why I'm more concerned with the Falcons offense than I am with the Falcons defense. There's really no excuse for a top 6 offense or whatever you want to call it, scoring only 6 points. There's plenty of excuses for the 25th, 22nd, whatever you want to say, best defense giving up 38 points in a game, right? Again, that doesn't mean you should do it, but it's just one of those things where, like, that's not unbelievable to me that you went on the road and you got the break speed off of you and looked like the worst defense in the NFL on the road, right? That's a far cry, but you also were like one of the worst offenses in the NFL, at least this past Sunday. And that is a far cry for what you have done consistently over the last 6 weeks, right? In the month of Kirktober, in the month of Kirkvember, as they say. So, we're getting into Kirkcember, right? And historically speaking, Kirk is not as efficient in December as he is in October and November across his NFL career. So we'll see if he can buck that trend and get the offense on track. But I don't think, like, I'm not sitting here panicking about the defense in similar ways, because it's just like I never had those expectations for the defense. But, I know one of the ways that people think that this defense can get better is by firing Jimmy Lake, right? I don't really agree with that, but let's talk about it as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Now, you might be a renter like me, and far too often you find yourself in this endless loop where you're watching your money vanish into thin air. And so I think it's time we end that loop, turn the rent game around, and start earning some serious rewards. And that's where Built Rewards comes in. Built is breaking ground as the neighborhood rewards program that hooks you up with points on your rent. Every month, pay your rent and watch the Built points roll in. Use the points to jet off on a dream vacation, and you can put your points towards flight or hotel stays or redeem them toward a future rent payment. They're designed to meet your lifestyle, whatever it is. Earn points by paying rent right now when you go to joinbuilt.com/lockedonnfl. That's joinbuilt.com/lockedonnfl. Make sure to use our URL so that they know we sent you at joinbuilt.com/lockedonnfl to start earning points with your rent payments today. So, should the Falcons fire Jimmy Lake? Now, Raheem Morris was asked about this on Monday in his press conference. Basically he was asked, is there a possibility that we could see potential coaching changes during the bye week, which is, a common thing, or relatively common, I guess you could say, in the NFL, where teams go through the bye week, they reassess, and they make changes. And one of those changes that sometimes happen is the possibility that Raheem Morris will take over defensive play calling over Jimmy Lake. Now, Raheem, in his answer to that question, basically said never say never, but kind of poured cold water on that, which I don't think should be a surprise. Now, Raheem Morris, Jimmy Lake, they go back almost 20 years as friends, colleagues. I don't think he's going to throw that away just because y'all or butthurt about that Broncos game. Again, understandably, I had to watch that game too. I was pissed off too. But, I don't think that one game is going to cause him to completely reevaluate their, 20 years, almost 2 decades of friendship and working together. Now, of course, that's always going to bring up cronyism accusations, which is a common thing, when it comes to coaches. It's less about what it's more about who in terms of, who gets ahead. I would say there are many, things beyond football that are like that in that regard. But, part of the reason why I'm not as fired up about, the Falcons defensive struggles is because I didn't really expect the Falcons defense to be better than this, going back to something I said earlier, right? All offseason, we talked about, the low expectations for this Falcons defense, that it was going to be a below average defense. It was just a question of how below average, right? Like, and I remember recalling saying something along the lines in May or June about, like, your best case scenario, your ceiling, your best case scenario, whatever you want to call it, it's probably the 18th best defense in the NFL, and your worst case scenario is probably the 28th best defense. And, do the eye level, in the middle, that's like what, 23, 24. That's kind of what the Falcons have been by, many defensive metrics, whether you're looking at all 11 games or, just the last 6 games in a lot of categories, right? And so I'll stress the point I made before. That's what we thought the defense was going to be, in May, June, July, all the way up until August 15th. And then we thought, oh, well, they added Matthew Judon, they added Justin Simmons. That's going to definitely raise the floor for what this defense could be. And instead of maybe being 28th, maybe they'll be 5 points better than that. And their ceiling is 5 points better than 18th or something like that. So 13 to 23 or something like that. And obviously we haven't really seen that, right? Those guys haven't really moved the needle in the ways that we thought they would. Now, you could certainly blame, the defensive scheme if you want to, for not necessarily maximizing those guys in the ways that we thought it should. I wouldn't sit here and say that that's an unfair criticism, right? But I don't know if that's a Jimmy Lake issue. That just might be a Raheem Morris scheme issue, because I think similarly back to when Raheem Morris first took over the Rams defense, that was a knock on his 2021 Rams defense, taking over Brandon Staley, when the previous year they were the best defense in the NFL. And people used that to knock Raheem Morris and be like, well, he inherited the best defense in the NFL, and now they're like 10th or 11th or whatever they were. And so clearly Raheem Morris is bad at his job. And, I don't know if that was a fair criticism, but I bring that up just because, this is kind of a trend with this type of scheme. You can argue it's not really built to maximize the talent in the ways of this is a defensive scheme that's built to be the best defense in the NFL. As I said, the Rams had that. And then Raheem came in, they tweaked the scheme a little bit, and then they weren't the best defense in the NFL. Now, it wasn't just purely Raheem's play calling and all that stuff. They lost a couple of starters and all that stuff. But it just goes back to the idea that this defense, I don't think, is built to, be, dreams of the Falcons having the best defense in the NFL are probably wasted, right? You might as well, wake up and think, I don't know, not dream about that anymore. I think more than likely, again, the goal is for this team to be good enough on defense to win games, right? It's if that means being the 18th best defense or the 22nd best defense or the 26th best defense, depending on how good the offense is, that's what they're going to be in order for them to win enough games to make the playoffs. And for me, for the time being, that's good enough, right? Again, I'm not expecting, Rome to be built in a day. Now, when it comes to firing defensive coordinators, it's not really a move, that you see from first-year head coaches. I did some research on this today. I read a Washington Post article that was written last year after Ron Rivera fired Jack Del Rio back with the Washington Commanders, when Del Rio's defenses were not doing a great enough job. And they wrote in that article, the Washington Post that they looked at 10 times over the previous decade, going back to 2010, 2011, where defensive coordinators were fired midseason. And the trend I noticed looking at that were 7 of those 10 times, it was lame duck head coaches that did it, right? Essentially coaches that got fired at the end of that season after they fired the defensive coordinator, basically firing that defensive coordinator as a last ditch effort to kind of save their jobs. And clearly it did not work for the vast majority of those guys. Now, the 3 exceptions in terms of the 10 instances of where defensive coordinators got fired midseason, it was the Philadelphia Eagles last year, where Nick Sirianni was on the hot seat, but kept his job after firing Sean Desai. The Raiders fired Paul Guenther when John Gruden was the head coach in 2020. And John Gruden stuck around for another season, and they got fired the next year, midway through the season. And then 2015, Sean Payton fired Rob Ryan before hiring Dennis Allen. And of course, Sean Payton would go on, spend another 5 years in New Orleans. Now, to me, what's interesting about that is Guenther and Rob Ryan were not first-year defensive coordinators. That was year 3 for Rob Ryan, and you think year 2 for Paul Guenther. And basically, it was 2 years of devastatingly bad defensive play that ultimately led to both of those guys losing their jobs. I couldn't find too many instances of first-year head coaches, first-year defensive coordinators outside of Sean Desai, where those guys got fired, right? And I also don't know of too many other instances, because this is not something that's readily available that you could do easy research on. But there weren't too many instances of head coaches stripping defensive coordinators of play calling duties midway through the season that I could find. Obviously it happens, but it's not something that seemingly from, just skimming through like NFC teams, didn't seem like it happened very often. But, obviously we in Atlanta are familiar with one instance where it did happen, where Dan Quinn back in 2016 stripped then defensive coordinator Richard Smith of play calling duties in around this time, week 12, week 13, and took over play calling for the rest of that season on that Falcons Super Bowl run. Richard Smith retained, he was still on the coaching staff for the remainder of the season, but then moved on from the following year. And again, that was year 2 of Richard Smith being the Falcons defensive coordinator. So again, there's not really a precedent for, this for, other than Sean Desai, and Sean Desai and Nick Sirianni didn't have 12 years of history. They never 20 years of history. They had never worked together, and basically Sean Desai got the job because they wanted a Fangio disciple. I was thinking like Staley or Fangio, but both, a Fangio Staley type of dude. And they were like, oh, Sean Desai's the next up and coming guy. And then they were like, nope, he's not the guy. So given Jimmy Lake and Raheem Morris's track background, given the history of firing, DCs by lame duck head coaches, I don't think it's likely to happen. I wouldn't hold your breath about it. It's certainly is not coming during the bye week. Almost certainly probably not going to come by the end of the year. If it is going to happen, it'll probably happen, November of 2025, right, next year. So I say all that not really in defense of Jimmy Lake. I have no real strong feelings, pro or con, against Jimmy Lake or whatever. But it does feel like, to me, part of the reason why I tend to be a little bit more dismissive of this is just because this is old hat for Falcon fans. Like, it's always hashtag fire this offensive coordinator pretty much every year whenever the Falcons are not successful, right? Just going back over the last 10 years, it's, Mike Nolan in 2014, defensive coordinator then, Kyle Shanahan in 2015, Steve Sarkisian in 2017, Marquand Manuel in 2018, 2019 and 2020 was Dirk Cutter, 2022 was Dean Pease, 2023 it was Arthur Smith. I can remember interactions with Falcon fans 20 years ago where it was like, fire Greg Knapp, RIP, and so it's not to sit here and be like these people don't deserve criticism, but it's either, to me, the only logical conclusions is either the Falcons just have the worst luck of hiring the worst coordinators pretty consistently year in and year out over the last, decade plus, or, which I think it probably is the second one, that firing the play caller isn't necessarily the automatic problem solver that so many people think it is, and that their actual issues go a little bit deeper than that. That's my personal stance on it, but, your mileage may vary, as I often like to say. So, it's interesting looking back at that 2018 season where Marquand Manuel got a lot of heat after a very promising 2017 season, and seeing all the parallels that you see with this current team, right? Where you offensively, you had Steve Sarkisian in a pretty talented offense, capable quarterback play, really talented skill position players, right? Similar to what you have right now. And defensively, it was struggle city, right? Similar to what you have right now. In 2017, that first year of Marquand Manuel, the defense made major strides in large part due to their pass rush improving in major ways, very similar to what we saw last year in Atlanta in 2023. And then they let arguably their two most productive pass rushers in Adrian Claiborne and Dontari Poe walk in free agency, similar to what we saw with Bud Dupree and Calais Campbell this offseason, trusting in their young talent. In 2018, that was Vic Beasley, Grady Jarrett, and Dak McKinley to pick up the slack. This year, they were trusting in, 3 rookies and Ruka Roro, Braylon Trice, and Brandon Dolis to pick up the slack, lost by those veteran players. And to Grady and Dak McKinley's credit, they did step up in 2018 and played really good football that year. Vic Beasley did not. Now, if you listen to a certain humble podcaster back then, you would have saw that coming. But, we won't go down that road anymore. But, you also saw in 2018, the Falcons even suffer major injuries. Ricardo Allen, Keanu Neal, both missed pretty much the entire season. Deion Jones missed most of the season, came back late in the season. And a lot of people wanted to blame the Falcons' defensive struggles, being a bottom 5 defense, on those injuries. And, I would say, I think you're overrating things, right? A top 10 defense doesn't lose 3 starters, even 3 starters as good as those guys were, and become a bottom 5 defense. Now, maybe the 19th best defense loses 3 starters and becomes a bottom 5 defense, but not a top 10 defense that some of those people were hyping up to be. Now, the other group of people weren't blaming the injuries. They were blaming it all on Marquand Manuel. And so when Marquand Manuel got fired at the end of the season, those folks felt very vindicated at that time. And Dan Quinn decided to take over play calling of the defense, right? And the narrative was, oh, Dan Quinn knows his defense better than anybody. And so this defense will benefit from Dan Quinn calling the defense, and it's going to lead to improvements. It didn't. Arguably the defense got a lot worse in the 5 games that Dan Quinn called the defense that year, or 5.5 games, because he basically relieved himself of play calling midway through Arizona Cardinals game against a rookie quarterback in Kyler Murray. At that time, the Cardinals being the worst team in the league, but they had dropped like 30 points on the Falcons in the first half of that game. But is that a parallel to what happened with Bo Nix yesterday? Not quite, but squint, you can see something similar. So, I know many of you guys skipped the intro, but when I say every single day on this podcast that I've been covering this team for a very long time, I have, right? I actually remember what happened in previous Falcon seasons. And unlike so many other Falcon fans where their only memories of the past is just all the draft picks that they're still butthurt about, 6 years later, I actually remember what happened during the games. And so there's lessons in there. Now, if you're asking me, like, would Raheem Morris fall as flat on his face as Dan Quinn did in 2019, taking a play? No, probably not. Raheem Morris actually has a body of work of being successful defensive coordinator in the NFL where Jimmy Lake doesn't. So I would assume Raheem would do a better job, but I'm just saying there's a lesson there that it didn't solve all the problems that I think so many people thought it was going to solve in 2018 and 2019 by just changing the defensive coordinator. And I don't think that's going to really solve all the Falcons' problems at this point in time. I think like it was back then, the Falcons need to invest more resources in their defense and get better players. And it's simple as that. But, it's simple, but it's not easy, right? Get better players, and it's going to take time for them to get better players. And that's why I don't necessarily see Raheem or the team needs to hit the panic button and feel like they have to, put it all on Jimmy Lake, during the bye week and basically say he's the scapegoat for all the Falcons' defensive problems. This is going to take time for this defense to be competent, is basically what I say. Again, good is certainly debatable whether we'll get there. Without really, really hitting on some draft picks and free agents moving forward. But I think you just got to be patient, guys. I'm sorry, but that's me. For me, like I look at the product on the field, and I'm like, yep, this is about what I thought it would going to be in the season. So why would I be bent out of shape looking at below average defensive play? Yeah, that's about it, right? What we saw on Sunday was not what I thought we would get from the Falcons offense. So to me, that to me is the more pressing issue, because again, if you were paying any attention, your expectations should have been again, not they were, but they should have been. This offense has the potential to be very good, and that's what's going to be the thing that drives our success. So the Falcons got to figure it out on both sides of the ball, but I think it's much more critical that they figure it out on the offensive side of the ball first if they're going to have success after this bye week. So we will talk more about this game tomorrow with our guest Alan Stirk, as well as the film breakdown. We'll get more into evaluating where this roster is, and you will hear later this week, similar to what you heard last year when we did this bye week breakdown after the disappointing Cardinals game and went through every position group and said, hey, they can get better at every single position group. We were going to do that later this week as well here on Locked On Falcons. So pay attention to that, because again, if you just think the problem is just, fire Jimmy Lake and all these other problems that you're going to hear me talk about later this week that the Falcons can get better at, will just go away. That's your prerogative, but you're going to be wondering why you're proven wrong in the end, but we'll see on that side. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen, guys. Okay, check out Locked On NFL as your second listen. Get 2 shows daily to get the lowdown on what's going on with the other 31 NFL teams. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.